In today's video, I want to have a look at the 360 Walk Mix Creator, which is at the heart of Sony's approach to spatial audio. It is capable of creating Sony 360 reality audio. Now, in case you're new to this, 360 reality audio is a spatial audio format that is based on MPEG-H, and it is competing with the Dolby Atmos standard for dominance in the 3D audio space. Now, this might be a shorter video because the 360 Walk Mix Creator is actually very simple and straightforward to use, but it also has quite significant disadvantages, which I wanted to talk about. So let's get started. Couple of things before we jump into our WalkMix project. First of all, I'm going to work with Ableton 12 on a Mac today, but the 360 WalkMix Creator works just as fine on Windows as well as on Macs and pretty much any digital audio workstation. Ableton is a stereo DAW. The WalkMix Creator has some added features that you can access if you're working with a multi-channel capable digital audio workstation. I will not talk about these today. However, I'm planning to release a second video specifically about working with multi-channel audio within the WalkMix Creator. This will include questions related to binaural head tracking. At the moment, I'm still waiting for one developer to update their software in order to make that head tracking work in this setup. Expect that video therefore to be released in a month or two. And then we need to briefly address the elephant in the room, and that is that the 360 WalkMix Creator is incredibly expensive. It currently comes in at $499 and there's also no educational version. So if you are a student, for example, you are out of luck. You need to shell out the full $500. When you compare this to competing formats, in particular Dolby Atmos, Sony 360 Reality Audio is the only 3D audio format that does not have some form of free or low-cost access. If you want to work with Dolby Atmos, for example, you can use the free version of Fiedler Audio's Dolby Atmos Composer to get started. And even the full Dolby Atmos renderer comes in at only $99 if you either have a Pro Tools subscription or are a student or a teacher. And on top of that, the MPEG-H authoring suite is completely free. You just need to go to the Fraunhofer website and download it. Only advanced spatialization tools such as Flux Audio's Spud Revolution have a similarly high financial barrier to entry. But those tools usually have completely different use cases that justify a higher price tag. It really puzzles me to no end that Sony has decided to make it exceptionally difficult to produce in the very spatial audio formats they want people to use. I will have some additional thoughts about that at the end of this video, but first let's hop into Ableton and check out how the WalkMix Creator actually works. But before I do that, let me quickly remind you that if you have enjoyed my video so far, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I publish weekly videos about all things spatial audio, game audio, and digital media in general. If you want to support this channel, you can do that by becoming a member either through YouTube or Patreon. There's also a free membership option on Patreon if you just want to lurk around. And you can also use one of the affiliate links below, or you can buy some of my merch, the In Immersion We Find Presents merch, like this mug, for example. Links are in the description as well. All contributions to this channel are used to purchase the software and hardware I talk about in my videos, such as the 360 WalkMix Creator, which once again was expensive. And finally, if you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join our Discord community. That link is in the description below. And with that being said, let's return to Ableton and the 360 WalkMix Creator. For this project, I'm going to use 3 simple loops that I have used in the past. Let's just have a brief listen on how that sounds. What we're going to do is we're going to spatialize this with the 360 WalkMix Creator, and we are going to then export the mix in 360 Reality Audio format. Now, the first thing that I need to do is I need to make sure that Ableton is set to a sample rate of 48 kHz. That's really the only thing that I need to do. So I'm going to go into the settings and I'm going to make sure that under audio I have 48 kHz enabled. That's really everything that I need to do in Ableton. And then we simply need to add the 360 WalkMix Creator to our project. Now, in contrast to Dolby Atmos or MPEG-H, there is only one plugin that we will use, and that plugin serves as both the renderer as well as the panner. In Dolby Atmos or MPEG-H, By contrast, panning is handled separately from rendering, and here really it's the same plugin. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to put an instance of the Walkmix creator on our main track, our master track, and this will serve as the renderer. So let's do that. So let's go into our plugin section and let's search for the 360 Walkmix Creator plugin. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the VST3 version because the audio unit version is really only usable in Logic. If you're using any other digital audio workstation, you're supposed to use the VST3 version. So let's just kind of select the VST3 version and we're going to drop that onto our main track. And as soon as I do that, it will open up and it will ask me if that's actually the renderer, if that's actually the one that is supposed on the master track. So I say, yes, it is, because this is going to serve as my renderer. Now, this is actually the last time we will have to deal with the master bus instance of the Walkmix Creator. So the next thing we need to do is we need to add the Walkmix Creator or instances of the Walkmix Creator to each individual track that we're going to use. In our particular case, we have 3 tracks. We're not going to deal with the 2 return tracks that Ableton created. We're just going to plug it on our 3 audio tracks. So let's do that. So let's click that away. And what we're going to do is we're going to take the Walkmix Creator and we're going to drop that on each individual track, the second one and the third one. Now, the interesting thing is that each of those instances works pretty much independently. So you can use either one of them to control the entire session. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the instance that sits on the first track. Now, in the interface, we see that the Walkmix Creator has identified 3 objects, or more accurately, actually 3 groups. And each group consists of 2 objects, which are for the left and the right channel for each of the individual object groups. Here on the left, we see the 3D image of where these objects are currently located. I have 2 views here. I can change the type of view from perspective to top, front, left, right, back, whatever I want. I can also make one view larger and kind of see more that particular way. In this view, I will see the individual objects. I can also turn on the speakers if I want to see how the speakers are located in that particular view. And I can also turn on and off the labels for the individual objects in case that bothers me. Now here on top, I have 3 different tabs. The first one is the panner tab, which kind of is responsible for everything that I have to do in terms of panning the objects around. Then I have the renderer tab that shows me the location of the individual speakers in relationship to the object. And then I have a reference tab that shows me the loudness so that I can actually manage that and kind of produce everything according to specifications. So let's go back to the panner section. Now here on the right, as I said before, I have the individual objects. I can mute or solo them. I can essentially select them. And if I select them, I also have the option to change the individual parameters by simply clicking on the fields here and kind of changing them through the keyboard. Now, before we can start moving our objects around, we first need to talk a little bit about the settings. And in order to access the settings, we click on this little cogwheel here, and that will open up the individual settings. I have a general tab that allows me to do some general kind of settings, for example, the scaling of the user interface. We will have to set the export folder. That's going to be something we're going to talk about a little bit later. Everything else is fairly straightforward. I can set the devices. Now, I'm not going to mess around with those. I'm going to just use the standard settings. The same thing for the headphones. Here I can add an additional HRTF profile if I want to, but I'm going to leave everything the way it is. I can also change the output channels. If I'm working with headphones and I have separate output channels for the headphone, I can set that here. The thing that's more important here is the speaker section. And in the speaker section, I can select the speaker layout. And for the speaker layout, I have a couple of different options, starting from stereo 2.0 up to a format that's called 13.0. Now, if you're working with a traditional Dolby Atmos setup, what you can do, for example, is you can select 7.0.4, and that will essentially kind of work with a traditional Dolby Atmos setup. Now, the one thing that's important to mention here is that the Walkmix Creator, or the 360 Reality Audio format, because it is built on MPEG-H, has the capability to work with speakers that are located below the listener position. And this is specified by the B here. So the B essentially means that there are 2 bottom speakers. So if we go to the last one, for example, the 13.1, specification that has 5 speakers that are in listener level, 5 speakers that are on top, and 3 speakers that are at the bottom. However, be aware that the bottom speakers in the standard settings at least are always in the front, so this isn't really fully 3D. Now, as I said, 360 Reality Audio is based on MPEG-H, and MPEG-H technically allows bottom speakers everywhere, but this is currently not implemented in the Walkmix Creator, and I also don't really know if there are any plans to add that in a future release. Now, I'm only working with stereo today, but I'm going to simply leave it at 13.0, and I'm going to use the binaural headphone rendering option instead. Now, the final step is to simply enable the Walkmix Creator, and this is done by pushing the Enable Processing button here. As soon as I do that, everything is run through the Walkmix Creator, and because I'm working with headphones, I also need to enable the headphone monitoring button. So if I click on that, it essentially enables headphone monitoring. So let's play our audio and check if we hear anything. So let's press play, and yes, we do. Now notice that the audio is currently routed through the Walkmix Creator, so if I turn off the processing, what will happen is it will still play the audio, but now the audio is not routed through the Walkmix Creator, it's actually routed through Ableton. And that essentially means that if I turn on processing, so let me maybe go to the mixer section here in Ableton so that I see that better. So if I'm now turning processing on, for example, you will see that the faders or the audio signal is disappearing, and that is simply because the audio is no longer passed through the traditional routing within Ableton, but instead through the Walkmix Creator routing. So whenever I enable the Walkmix Creator, the faders become non-functional and I have to do everything within the Walkmix Creator. Now, fortunately, this is actually fairly straightforward to do because once again, one instance controls everything, and I can actually kind of turn that into something that is full screen and then just work in the full screen version of the Walkmix Creator. So let's change the position of objects, and this is done very easily by simply dragging them around. So I can kind of grab them here and kind of drag them around. Now, you notice that the stereo pairs are moved together, and this is because they are currently locked. So if I'm, for example, going into the stereo pair for the first track, I see here this lock symbol, and if I essentially click on that lock signal, the two objects are disconnected, and what I can do now is I can drag each of the two speakers independently, and I can then lock them again and move them again, kind of maintaining the difference between the two different speakers. Now, as I said before, I can also simply go into the properties section here and change that manually. So here I can, for example, say I want to have them closer together by changing the width to 80. Or if I disconnect them, I can go into each individual object and can change the azimuth, the elevation, or the gain. Now, the Walkmix Creator also keeps track of everything that I do. So if I make a change that I didn't like, I can actually go back, and this is done by clicking here on the Go Back button. So if I didn't like what I did there, for example, by kind of changing the location of this one object, I simply can go back, and that will eventually kind of bring it back to where it was. I also have an entire history section that kind of shows me exactly each individual step, and I can use that in order to go back and forth, depending on what exactly I did and what I liked and what I didn't like. Now notice that I have only very limited options with respect to how I can actually change those objects. The objects all move on a sphere, so I only have elevation and azimuth control. There is no distance option. This is handled through the gain, and most importantly, there's also no object size option. On the one hand, these restrictions seem limiting, but on the other hand, they also make the Walkmix Creator incredibly easy to use. Sometimes less is simply more. Now, a couple of additional things. First of all, if you want to automate any parameters, you can do that in the traditional way your digital audio workstation works. However, be aware that because the Walkmix Creator handles all parameters of all instances in every single instance, you need to be a little bit careful on where exactly you're going to automate your parameters. So for example, if I have the instance open that is on the first track, I can obviously only automate the parameters from that particular track. So if I go into the settings here and I say configure, and I essentially click on that, I will see the azimuth and the elevation of the first object. However, if I do the same thing for example, for the second track here, it will not show up because that is supposed to be automated on the second track. And finally, let's talk about export. Now, this is actually fairly easy to do. However, there is one thing we need to make sure, and that is that the folder settings of the export folder within the Walkmix Creator needs to be the same folder as the one that you're using for exporting or bouncing the audio in your digital audio workstation, in this particular case in Ableton. If these two folders are set the same, then what will happen is that the Walkmix Creator will actually catch the traditional export and prompt you with an additional export window once the export from Ableton has been completed. So let's see how that works in action. Now, the first thing, let's just make sure that we have the same folder. And for that, I'm once again going into the settings here, and in the device, or in the general section, sorry, I see here the export folder is my desktop, and that essentially means that I also need to export or bounce the audio from Ableton onto the desktop. So let's do that. Let me close the Walkmix Creator here, and maybe let's also close the configure here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the live file, export audio video, and here I'm simply going to export everything. And then let's press the export button, and once I've done that, I'm prompted with the export window where I want to export it. And once again, I need to export it into the folder that is set in the Walkmix Creator, and in my particular case it was the desktop. So let's just save it on the desktop. And this will first export the Ableton file. Now, nothing has happened apparently, but that is because there is something happening in the Walkmix Creator. So what I need to do is I need to open up an instance of the Walkmix Creator, and as soon as I do that, I see that the Walkmix Creator is now presenting me with an additional export window, and here I can choose the export settings for the export of the 360 Reality Audio format, and there are a couple of things that I can do. Now, the one thing that I want to point out here is that even though this has an ADM setting, this is not Dolby Atmos ADM. Be aware of that. ADM is just a general format, and it has many different variations. So unfortunately, if you export this in ADM format, you cannot upload that to whatever, for example, DistroKid or any other distribution platform requires for Dolby Atmos. So this is not Dolby Atmos compatible. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to simply export that as MPEG-H in MP4 format, and I'm going to choose to export that, why not, in level 3. And then I'm simply going to press OK. And once I've done that, it will essentially create the export, and I now have my export in 360 Reality Audio format. The Walkmix Creator now created a folder here, and in this folder I have the resulting MP4. Now, it is important to understand that this is an MP4 that you cannot simply play on a regular player. Once again, this is an MPEG-H MP4. In order to play it, you need to use the included Walkmix player. So let me just open up the Walkmix player here. And in the Walkmix player, I can simply say add the track. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that track here. And then once I've added that, I can press play. And that will play the audio. And everything worked exactly the way it's supposed to work. Now, unfortunately, I don't really see exactly what's going on in that particular file, so I don't have a visualization that tells me where the objects are and how they are moving and if they are moving correctly. One thing that I can do in order to at least check the metadata is I can use a tool such as Media Info, for example. So let me just find Media Info here. Where do we have it? Here we have it, Media Info, and then I can simply drop that file, and here we have it, and simply drop that into Media Info, and then I see in Media Info that I'm dealing with an MPEG-4 file that is actually an MPEG-H 3D audio stream, and it has 24 channels, which is 22.2, and that should give me enough information in order to make sure that the audio has actually been created correctly. So what are my final thoughts? Well, first of all, I have to admit that in the space of 3D audio production, the 360 Walkmix Creator workflow is clearly the easiest. This would be the perfect starting point for anybody who wants to get into spatial audio. Would be because, for one, its usefulness is really limited. From what I understand, you currently need to use Sony's distribution services in order to distribute 360 Reality Audio content, and access to the distribution channel is limited. 360 Reality Audio is currently not useful if you're using anything like DistroKid, for example. You simply can't use it there. And then there is the price tag of $500 for the Walkmix Creator license, which to me seems absolutely ridiculous, especially when compared to competing technologies. It's almost as if Sony does not want us to use it. And on top of everything, customer support was really laughable when I contacted them about the possibility of an educational license. It took them a full 3 weeks to get back to me. And when I had a follow-up question, they needed an additional 2.5 weeks to answer my follow-up question. If anybody at Sony is listening to this, please, for the love of God, make your software accessible to the average producer. The way you're maintaining these artificial barriers right now is ridiculous, beyond belief. This is a very good piece of software, but nobody will use it if you cannot use it. And this is particularly true for students who, quite frankly, should be among your core target audience, because those are the people who will make the decisions about what 3D audio format they will use in the future. And if you don't give them easy access, they will simply decide on something else. But what are your thoughts? Do you currently use the 360 Walkmix Creator? Do you want to use it? Did you ever have a successful interaction with Sony's support? I'm just curious. What do you think about Sony's approach to pretty much target only high-end production studios? Let me know in the comment section below or join our Discord community for a chat. And with that being said, see you all at the next video.